Today, I've prepared the biography of Nefertiti. Before you fall asleep, make sure to tell us from where you're listening and what time it is. Now, calm down and listen to the story while falling asleep. I'm wishing you a cozy and comfortable night. As you settle into your soft pillows and pull your blankets close, we'll drift back in time to ancient Egypt, to the days when the sun blazed over the Nile and the mysterious Queen Nefertiti walked the palace halls. Her name means the beautiful one has come, and tonight we'll explore her fascinating life as you gently drift toward dreams. Let your breathing slow as we journey to the 14th century BCE, where golden sands and whispered secrets await us. The ancient world is calling softly, and Nefertiti's story will carry you peacefully into slumber. In the gentle embrace of ancient Egypt, around the year 1370 BCE, a child was born who would one day become one of history's most enigmatic and beautiful queens. Little Nefertiti came into the world during the prosperous 18th dynasty, when the Egyptian civilization flourished along the life-giving waters of the Nile River. The soft morning light would have filtered through the tall papyrus reeds that lined the riverbanks, casting dappled patterns across the stone floors of noble homes. As this future queen took her first breaths, it was as if her parents had glimpsed her destiny, sensing that their daughter would one day embody beauty and grace that would transcend time itself. Though historical records from this distant era remain incomplete, like fragments of a dream partially remembered upon waking, most scholars believe Nefertiti was born into nobility, though not of direct royal lineage. Imagine little Nefertiti's childhood home, a spacious dwelling with cool stone floors and high ceilings that kept the intense Egyptian heat at bay. Walls adorned with colorful paintings depicted scenes of daily life, religious rituals, and the abundant natural world that surrounded them. Servants would move quietly through the rooms, their footsteps gentle as they carried out their daily tasks, while in the courtyard, a small garden might have contained flowering plants, their sweet scents drifting through open windows. As a child of nobility, young Nefertiti would have been raised with careful attention to her education and upbringing. Unlike many girls of her time, she would have received instruction in reading and writing hieroglyphics, those beautiful and complex symbols that decorated temple walls and papyrus scrolls. Picture her small hands learning to hold a reed brush, dipping it carefully into ink made from charcoal mixed with water, practicing the sacred symbols under the watchful eye of a patient tutor. The rhythms of her childhood days would have followed the natural cycles that governed Egyptian life. She would awaken as the first golden rays of the sun, revered as the god Ra touched the eastern horizon. The mornings might have been spent in lessons or observing the household management that would one day be her responsibility. In the heat of the afternoon, like most Egyptians, she would rest in the coolest parts of the house, perhaps listening to stories told by servants or family members. about the gods and goddesses who ruled their world. Her father, I, is believed by many historians to have been a high-ranking official, a trusted advisor to the pharaoh Amenhotep III. I was a man of considerable influence, whose wisdom and counsel were valued in the royal court. From him, young Nefertiti would have absorbed early lessons in diplomacy and the complex web of relationships that formed Egyptian politics. Imagine him returning home in the evening, his linen robes still bearing the faint scent of incense from the palace, sitting with his daughter in the fading light to share carefully chosen stories of his day. Of Nefertiti's mother, history has left us little more than whispers. Some believe she may have died when Nefertiti was quite young, a common tragedy in those ancient times when childbirth and disease claimed many lives. If this was so, Nefertiti might have been raised by her father and perhaps a stepmother, or by the network of female relatives that often surrounded noble children. The absence of a mother would have been a soft sorrow in her young life, like a shadow that lengthens as the sun sets, but never fully disappears. As she grew from a child into a young woman, Nefertiti would have become increasingly aware of the religious practices that formed the foundation of Egyptian society. The worship of many gods and goddesses created a rich tapestry of beliefs that explained the world around them. The annual flooding of the Nile, which brought fertile soil and abundant crops, was seen as a divine gift. The passage of the sun across the sky each day represented the journey of Ra in his solar boat. These beliefs were not abstract concepts, but living realities that shaped every aspect of daily life. Imagine young Nefertiti accompanying her family to temple ceremonies, walking slowly through the massive stone gateways, her eyes widening at the sight of towering columns, carved with images of deities and pharaohs. The air would be heavy with the scent of burning incense, the sound of chanting priests, creating a hypnotic backdrop to the sacred rituals. These experiences would have planted the seeds of the deep religious conviction that would later define her reign as queen. The Egypt of Nefertiti's youth was a land of striking contrasts. Along the narrow strip of fertile land that bordered the Nile, fields of barley, wheat, and flax stretched toward the horizon, tended by farmers whose agricultural practices had changed little for thousands of years. Beyond this green ribbon lay the vast, silent desert, its golden sands holding both danger and spiritual significance. The Egyptians called their land Kemet, the Black Land, referring to the rich soil deposited by the Nile's annual flood, while the desert was Deseret, the Red Land, a realm associated with chaos and death. In the cities and towns, life pulsed with activity. Markets bustled with traders selling goods from distant lands, cedar wood from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, ebony and ivory from Nubia to the south. Craftsmen practiced their specialized trades, creating objects of remarkable beauty and sophistication. Scribes recorded transactions, religious texts, and the decrees of the pharaoh, their knowledge of writing setting them apart as an elite class. As a nobleman's daughter, Nefertiti would have been somewhat sheltered from the harsher realities of Egyptian life, but she would still have witnessed the social hierarchy that structured her society. At the pinnacle stood the pharaoh, considered a living god, the intermediary between the divine and human realms. Below him were the nobles, priests, and scribes, then soldiers, craftsmen, merchants, and farmers. At the bottom were servants and slaves, many captured in military campaigns against neighboring lands. When Nefertiti reached her early teens, her education would have shifted toward the skills she would need as a noblewoman and potential bride. She would learn to manage a household, to direct servants, to oversee the preparation of food and the making of clothing. She would be instructed in the proper ways to honor the gods and to participate in religious ceremonies. Music and dance might have been part of her education as well, as these arts were highly valued in Egyptian culture. Personal adornment was important for Egyptian women of status, and young Nefertiti would have been taught to apply the cosmetics that were considered both beautiful and protective. Kohl, a dark powder made from ground minerals, was applied around the eyes, believed to ward off eye diseases and the harsh glare of the sun. Red ochre colored lips and cheeks, while henna might be used to stain the nails and perhaps the hair. Scented oils and unguents soothed the skin dried by the hot climate and added a pleasant fragrance as she approached marriageable age, which could be as young as 12 or 13 in ancient Egypt. Nefertiti's father would have been considering potential matches for his daughter. Marriage was primarily a social and economic arrangement, particularly among the nobility, where alliances between families could strengthen political positions. Yet, there is evidence that emotional bonds between husbands and wives were also valued, with Egyptian art and literature depicting affection and companionship between couples. It was during these formative years that the seeds of change were being planted in Egyptian society, though perhaps few recognized them at the time. The pharaoh Amenhotep III had ruled for nearly 4 decades, presiding over a period of unprecedented prosperity and artistic achievement. His son and heir, Amenhotep IV, who would later rename himself Akhenaten, was developing ideas about religion that would dramatically depart from tradition, focusing worship on a single deity, the Aten, represented as the sun disk. Whether Nefertiti met her future husband during these early years is unknown, lost to the gentle erosion of time that has worn away so many details of ancient lives. Some historians suggest that their marriage may have been arranged when she was quite young, as was common practice, with the actual wedding taking place when she reached puberty. Others propose that Amenhotep IV may have chosen her himself, perhaps struck by her beauty and intelligence. What we do know is that by around the age of 15, Nefertiti had become the great royal wife of Amenhotep IV, elevated to a position of tremendous influence and visibility. The transition from nobleman's daughter to queen would have been profound, surrounding her with new responsibilities, expectations, and the complex politics of the royal court. Her jewelry would have been magnificent, broad collars of gold, inlaid with colorful stones, bracelets, anklets, and perhaps a headdress befitting her new royal status. The ceremony itself would have been conducted with all the pomp and ritual befitting the marriage of Egypt's divine ruler, with offerings to the gods, music, feasting, and formal processions. As she embarked on this new chapter of her life, Nefertiti carried with her the lessons of her childhood and early youth, the understanding of social hierarchies, the importance of religious devotion, the skills of diplomacy she had observed in her father. These formative experiences had shaped her into a young woman, prepared to stand beside a pharaoh who would soon challenge Egypt's most fundamental traditions. The Egypt of Nefertiti's childhood was a land of ancient certainties, where the rhythms of life had flowed relatively unchanged for centuries. The annual flooding of the Nile brought fertility to the fields. The pharaoh ensured cosmic order through proper worship of the gods. The dead journeyed to the afterlife if properly prepared. These were the foundations upon which Egyptian civilization had been built and sustained. Yet, within Nefertiti's lifetime, some of these certainties would be questioned in ways that would shake Egyptian society to its core. The religious revolution initiated by her husband would elevate her to unprecedented prominence, while simultaneously creating profound tensions within the royal court and among the powerful priesthood. The beautiful child, who had grown up surrounded by the traditional pantheon of Egyptian gods, would become the iconic queen of a radical new monotheistic religion. As we drift back through the mists of time, trying to glimpse the early life of this remarkable woman, we are left with fragments and suggestions rather than a complete portrait, like the famous bust of Nefertiti that captures her serene beauty but cannot tell us her thoughts. The historical record preserves outlines, but not the full texture of her childhood experiences. Yet in these outlines, we can sense the formation of a character marked by intelligence, adaptability, and strength qualities that would serve her well in the tumultuous years to come. The gentle current of the Nile continues its timeless journey, carrying away the days and years, just as it did when young Nefertiti gazed upon its waters over 3,000 years ago. The same stars that looked down upon her childhood nights still shine in the velvet darkness above Egypt, unchanging witnesses to the brief, brilliant life of the queen, whose name means the beautiful one has come, and whose legacy continues to captivate our imagination across the vast expanse of centuries. Let us drift further into the story as we explore the next part of this fascinating journey. In the soft glow of ancient Egypt, beneath a sky scattered with stars like jewels on indigo silk. There lived a young girl destined to become one of history's most enigmatic queens. Nefertiti, whose name would come to mean the beautiful one has come, was born into a world of tradition and ritual that stretched back thousands of years along the life-giving banks of the Nile River. As we close our eyes and journey back through time, we can almost feel the warm desert breeze carrying the scent of lotus flowers, and hear the gentle lapping of the sacred river against the reedy shores. Nefertiti's family origins remain partially veiled in the gentle mists of antiquity, like the morning fog that once rose from the Nile before being tenderly dissolved by the sun's golden rays. Most scholars believe she was born around 1370 BCE in the city of Akhmim, a place of ancient temples and whispered prayers. Her father was a wealthy and influential courtier who served as a trusted advisor to the royal family. Himself came from a lineage of respected officials, people who understood the delicate balance of power and tradition that kept Egyptian society flowing smoothly. Much like the predictable and life-sustaining annual floods of their beloved river, I's own ancestry traced back through generations of noble Egyptian families who had served the pharaohs faithfully. These were people who knew the importance of harmony, Ma'at, as the Egyptians called it, the cosmic order that governed everything from the movement of the stars to the proper relationships between people. This concept of balance and rightness would have been woven into the fabric of young Nefertiti's earliest memories, like the intricate patterns in the linens that draped the family's home. Her mother's identity remains a gentle mystery, lost to the soft erosion of time. Some believe she may have died when Nefertiti was very young, her face perhaps becoming a fading dream in her daughter's memory, like the last stars that disappear as dawn approaches. Others suggest she may have been a lady of the royal court, perhaps even with connections to foreign lands, which might explain Nefertiti's later comfort with diplomatic matters. In the absence of a mother, Nefertiti was likely raised by her father and perhaps a stepmother, surrounded by servants and tutors who recognized the special quality in this observant, graceful child. The family home would have been a spacious dwelling, cool within despite the desert heat, with painted walls depicting scenes from nature, birds soaring over papyrus thickets, fish swimming in the life-giving Nile, lotus flowers opening to greet the morning sun. These images were not merely decorative, but represented the Egyptian understanding of a world in perfect balance, where each creature and plant had its proper place in the divine order. In the evenings, as the heat of the day gradually surrendered to the cool embrace of night, Nefertiti might have sat in the family garden, listening to the stories told by elders, tales of the gods and goddesses who governed the universe, of Isis and Osiris, of Ra's daily journey across the sky in his solar bark. These stories weren't simply entertainment. formed the foundation of the Egyptian worldview, explaining everything from the changing seasons to the promise of eternal life. Her family would have observed the many festivals that marked the Egyptian calendar, each celebration flowing into the next like the waters of the Nile itself. There was the joyous festival of Apet, when the god Amun traveled from Karnak to Luxor in an elaborate procession, the beautiful feast of the valley, when families remembered their ancestors, and the hopeful celebration of the new year, coinciding with the life-bringing inundation of the Nile. Each festival carried its own traditions, its own foods and music, its own prayers and offerings to the gods. As a child of nobility, Nefertiti would have received an education unusual for most Egyptian girls. She likely learned to read and write hieroglyphs, those beautiful picture symbols that adorned temple walls and papyrus scrolls. Perhaps she sat in the cool shade of a sycamore fig tree, carefully practicing these sacred signs under the watchful eye of a patient tutor. The ability to read would have opened up worlds to her. The wisdom of ancient texts, the hymns to the gods, the records of Egypt's glorious history, stretching back to the time when the first pharaoh united the two lands. Music would have flowed through her childhood home like a gentle stream. The soft notes of harps and flutes, the rhythmic beating of drums, the sweet voices of singers praising the gods. These sounds would have formed the backdrop to her earliest memories. Perhaps she learned to play the sistrum, a sacred rattle associated with the goddess Hathor. Its delicate tinkling, believed to please the divine beings who watched over Egypt. The women in Nefertiti's family would have passed down their knowledge of beauty rituals and adornment. The careful application of kohl around the eyes, not merely for beauty, but for protection against the harsh glare of the sun. The use of henna to color the nails and hair, the blending of precious oils and unguents to soften the skin against the dry desert air. These were not acts of vanity, but sacred traditions, ways of honoring the body as a divine creation. From her father, Nefertiti would have absorbed lessons in diplomacy and statecraft. I was known for his wisdom and political acumen, skills that allowed him to navigate the sometimes treacherous waters of court politics. As she grew old enough to understand, he might have shared with her observations about the nature of power, the importance of alliances, and the delicate art of knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. These lessons would serve her well in the years to come, as she rose to become not merely a queen, but a partner in governance to her future husband. The family's religious observances would have followed the traditional Egyptian pantheon, the worship of Amun-Ra, the king of the gods, Osiris, lord of the afterlife, Isis, the divine mother Hathor, goddess of love and music, and dozens of other deities who governed every aspect of life and death. In the family shrine, offerings of food, flowers, and incense would have been made daily, the smoke rising like prayers to heaven. Nefertiti would have learned the proper words to speak, the correct gestures to make, the appropriate offerings for each god or goddess. As she approached womanhood, Nefertiti's family connections likely brought her to the attention of the royal court. Perhaps it was during one of the great festivals, when nobles from throughout Egypt gathered to pay homage to the pharaoh, that she first caught the eye of the young prince who would become Amenhotep IV, later known as Akhenaten. Or perhaps the connection was more deliberate. A carefully arranged introduction orchestrated by her father, who understood the value of placing his beautiful, intelligent daughter in proximity to the future king. The marriage of Nefertiti to the young prince would have been celebrated with all the splendor befitting a royal union. Boats adorned with flowers would have processed along the Nile, musicians playing joyful melodies, dancers performing in honor of the divine couple. The bride would have been adorned with jewels of gold and lapis lazuli, her slender form draped in the finest linen, her eyes accentuated with kohl, her lips stained with red ochre. The wedding gifts would have been lavish, furniture inlaid with ivory and gold, chests filled with precious oils and unguents, vessels of silver and alabaster. Yet, within Nefertiti's lifetime, some of these certainties would be questioned in ways that would shake Egyptian society to its core. The religious revolution initiated by her husband would elevate her to unprecedented prominence, while simultaneously creating profound tensions within the royal court and among the powerful priesthood. The beautiful child, who had grown up surrounded by the traditional pantheon of Egyptian gods, would become the iconic queen of a radical new monotheistic religion. This transformation did not happen suddenly, but evolved gradually, like the slow changing of the seasons. The seeds may have been planted early in Nefertiti's marriage, as she and her husband observed the growing power of the priests of Amen, whose temples had accumulated vast wealth, and whose influence sometimes rivaled that of the pharaoh himself, perhaps in quiet conversations in the royal gardens. As evening painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, the royal couple began to question the traditional religious structures that had defined Egyptian life for centuries, the family traditions that had shaped Nefertiti's early years, the festivals honoring multiple gods, the offerings at household shrines, the stories of divine beings who took many forms, would be replaced by devotion to a single deity, the Aten, represented as the sun disk, whose rays ended in tiny hands bestowing life. This was not merely a theological shift, but a complete reimagining of the relationship between humans and the divine, between the royal family and their subjects, between Egypt and the wider world. As we drift deeper into our contemplation of Nefertiti's life, we might wonder how she reconciled her early religious training with this revolutionary new vision. Did she embrace the worship of the Aten immediately, seeing in it a purer form of devotion? Or did she, like many Egyptians, struggle to abandon the gods who had watched over her family for generations. The historical record, like a dream partially remembered upon waking, offers tantalizing hints, but no definitive answers. What we do know is that Nefertiti stood beside her husband as he changed his name from Amenhotep IV to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten. And as he moved the capital from Thebes to a new city called Akhetaten, horizon of the Aten, at the site of modern Amarna, this was no small upheaval, but a complete reorientation of Egyptian society, as if the Nile itself had changed its course. In artwork from this period, Nefertiti is depicted with a prominence unusual for Egyptian queens. She appears alongside her husband in scenes of worship, her figure the same size as his, a visual equality that spoke volumes in a culture where artistic conventions were laden with meaning. In some reliefs, she is shown driving her own chariot or smiting enemies, activities traditionally reserved for the pharaoh. These images suggest that whatever private doubts or conflicts she may have experienced, publicly, she embraced her role as the feminine counterpart to Akhenaten, both of them children of the Aten, both of them mediators between the divine and the human. The family life she created with Akhenaten seems to have been unusually intimate by royal Egyptian standards. Artwork shows the royal couple playing with their daughters, kissing them, holding them on their laps, tender domestic scenes rarely depicted in earlier Egyptian art. Perhaps in creating this close-knit family unit, Nefertiti was drawing on memories of her own childhood, recreating the warmth and security she had known in her father's house, or perhaps creating the maternal presence she herself might have missed. As our thoughts continue to drift through the sands of time, we might imagine Nefertiti in a quiet moment, perhaps standing on a balcony of the royal palace at Akhetaten, watching the sun set over the Nile. The golden light would have illuminated her famous profile, the high cheekbones, the graceful neck, the full lips that have made her face one of the most recognizable in all of ancient art. What thoughts moved behind those almond-shaped eyes? Did she feel the weight of tradition she had helped to set aside? Did she wonder about the gods of her childhood? Did she ever question the path she and her husband had chosen? The answers lie beyond our reach, like stars too distant for even the clearest night to reveal. What remains is the legacy of a woman who stood at the crossroads of tradition and revolution, who moved from the familiar religious practices of her family to an entirely new conception of the divine, who transformed from a nobleman's daughter to a queen whose image would endure for more than 3,000 years. As sleep begins to enfold us in its gentle embrace, we might imagine Nefertiti finding her own peace, reconciling the varied strands of her heritage and experience into a coherent whole. Perhaps in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world was still and silent, she found a way to honor both the traditions that had shaped her early years and the new vision she helped to bring into being. In that imagined moment of integration and acceptance, we too might find our own rest, drifting into dreams as ancient and mysterious as Egypt itself. The peaceful narrative of this life continues as we turn our attention to what happened next in the soft glow of dawn. When the first light caressed the eastern horizon of ancient Egypt, young Nefertiti would have stirred from sleep in her childhood home in Akhmim, a city nestled along the life-giving Nile. The gentle murmur of the sacred river would have been the constant backdrop to her earliest memories, a soothing rhythm that flowed through the days and seasons of her young life. This was the world that cradled the girl who would one day become Egypt's most iconic queen. The air in her childhood home would have carried the mingled scents of fresh bread baking in clay ovens, the delicate fragrance of lotus flowers floating in ceramic bowls, and the earthy aroma of the river itself, a perfume both ancient and ever-renewed. The morning light would filter through latticed windows, casting dappled patterns across limestone floors worn smooth by generations of footsteps. Nefertiti, whose name means "the beautiful one has come," likely grew up in a spacious villa befitting the daughter of Ai, a wealthy and influential nobleman. The walls of their home would have been painted with scenes of nature, birds soaring over papyrus thickets, fish swimming in azure waters, and flowers unfurling their petals toward an ever-benevolent sun. These images, rendered in rich blues, warm ochres, and verdant greens, would have been among her first visual lessons in the harmonious order that Egyptians called mad, the fundamental balance of all things. In the cool mornings, before the heat of the day intensified, Nefertiti might have wandered through inner courtyards where date palms and sycamore fig trees provided welcome shade. Small pools collected precious water, their surfaces occasionally disturbed by the gentle touch of a falling blossom or the quick darting movement of a dragonfly. The sound of water trickling from slender channels into these pools would have added another layer to the gentle soundscape of her childhood, a delicate counterpoint to the deeper voice of the nearby Nile. The household would awaken gradually, like a flower slowly opening to the sun. Servants would move with practiced efficiency, sweeping floors with palm frond brooms, preparing morning meals, and attending to the countless small tasks that maintained the rhythm of daily life. The soft pad of bare feet on stone, the quiet clinking of copper vessels, the low murmur of voices. These would have formed the gentle morning chorus that welcomed each new day. As the daughter of Ai, Nefertiti would have been raised with careful attention to her education. Unlike many girls of her time, she would have been taught to read and write the sacred hieroglyphs, an honor usually reserved for boys destined for scribal positions. Perhaps she sat in the dappled shade of a garden arbor, a wooden writing palette balanced on her lap, carefully tracing the elegant symbols onto papyrus or practice ostraca. Fragments of pottery used by students, the scratch of reed pen against surface, the earthy smell of the ink made from soot and gum Arabic. The concentration required to form each character correctly. These sensations would have been woven into the fabric of her learning beyond the walls of her family compound. The city of Akhmim pulsed with life. The streets would have been narrow and winding, offering blessed shade from the intense Egyptian sun. Buildings of mud brick, plastered and painted white to reflect the heat, would have clustered together like a gathering of silent sentinels. From her home, Nefertiti might have heard the distant calls of market vendors, the bleating of goats, the occasional braying of donkeys laden with goods for trade. These sounds would drift through the air, softened by distance, a reminder of the busy world beyond her sheltered existence. The marketplace would have been a feast for the senses, a place Nefertiti might have visited accompanied by servants, and perhaps her mother or nurse. Here, the aromas would intensify and multiply. Fresh fish from the river, still glistening with water. Pyramids of spices in earthy reds, yellows, and browns. The sweet perfume of honey and dried fruits. The sharp tang of fermented foods. Vendors would call out their wares in melodic chants that had changed little over countless generations. Craftspeople would work in open stalls, potters shaping clay with practiced hands, weavers creating cloth of exceptional fineness, jewelers setting precious stones in gold settings that caught and reflected the sunlight. The rhythm of Nefertiti's childhood would have followed the eternal cycles that governed Egyptian life. The inundation of the Nile, beginning each year in June, would transform the landscape, turning the river into a vast, slow-moving lake that covered the fields with life-giving silt. During these months, when agricultural work paused, festivals and religious observances would take center stage. Nefertiti would have witnessed processions of priests carrying sacred barks, heard the hypnotic rhythms of sistrum rattles and drums, seen dancers moving with sinuous grace in honor of the gods. As the waters receded, leaving behind the rich, dark soil, the planting season would begin. From the windows of her home, or perhaps from a rooftop terrace, Nefertiti would have watched farmers working in the fields, their movements as choreographed and timeless as a dance, the plows cutting through earth, the careful scattering of seeds, the patient tending of growing plants. These activities would have unfolded before her eyes like a living tapestry of Egyptian life. The harvest season would bring its own particular energy, a time of intense activity and celebration. The air would fill with the dust of thrashing, the sweet scent of ripened grain, and the sounds of songs that had accompanied this work since time immemorial. In the evenings, as the heat of the day subsided, Nefertiti might have sat with her family on the roof of their home, enjoying the cooler air and watching the stars emerge in the vast Egyptian sky. The same stars that her ancestors had used to predict the flooding of the Nile and to chart the passage of time. The natural world beyond the city would have been equally formative in young Nefertiti's development. The desert, stretching away to the horizon in undulating waves of gold and amber, would have been a constant presence. Beautiful, dangerous, and sacred, the contrast between the fertile black land of the Nile Valley and the red land of the desert embodied the Egyptian understanding of balance and duality. Nefertiti would have grown up absorbing this fundamental concept, seeing in the landscape itself a reflection of the cosmic order. The river itself would have been a source of endless fascination and life. Along its banks, papyrus reeds grew in thick stands, providing material for everything from paper to sandals, boats to rope. Lotus flowers opened their petals at dawn and closed them at dusk, a daily miracle that symbolized rebirth and regeneration. Birds of astonishing variety, ibises, herons, kingfishers, geese, would have wheeled overhead or waded in the shallows, their calls adding to the river's symphony. In this environment of natural abundance and cultural richness, Nefertiti would have been surrounded by images of the divine. The gods of Egypt were not distant, abstract entities, but present in every aspect of daily life. Hathor, the goddess of love, music, and motherhood, might have had a small shrine in the family home, where offerings of flowers, food, or incense could be placed. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, would have been invoked during her lessons. Amun-Ra, the supreme deity of Thebes, would have been honored in grand temples, whose massive pylons and soaring columns dominated the cityscape. The religious practices of her family would have followed traditions established thousands of years earlier. Each morning, Nefertiti might have watched her father or mother make offerings to household deities, lighting small oil lamps, murmuring prayers, perhaps playing a simple melody on a flute or harp to please the gods. These rituals, performed with quiet reverence, would have instilled in her a sense of connection to forces greater than herself, a awareness of the thin veil that separated the world of humans from the realm of the divine. Social relationships would have been carefully defined and maintained in Nefertiti's world. As the daughter of a nobleman, she would have been raised to understand her place in the intricate hierarchy of Egyptian society. Her interactions with others would have been governed by protocols and expectations that had evolved over centuries. With her family, there would have been warmth and affection, expressed through gentle touches, shared meals, and the telling of stories in the cool evenings. With servants, she would have learned to be firm but fair, maintaining the distance required by her station while acknowledging their humanity. Her education would have extended beyond reading and writing to include the social graces expected of a young woman of her class. She would have been taught to play musical instruments, perhaps the harp or lute, and to sing songs that had been passed down through generations. She would have learned the intricate art of personal adornment, how to apply kohl to enhance her eyes, how to select jewelry appropriate to different occasions, how to wear the fine linen garments that distinguished the nobility from commoners. The sounds of music would have been woven through the fabric of her days. Harps with their gentle, rippling notes, flutes producing clear, bird-like melodies, drums marking time with their steady heartbeat rhythms. These instruments would have accompanied both sacred and secular occasions. Music was not merely entertainment, but a means of communicating with the divine, of expressing emotions too profound for words alone, of marking the significant transitions of life. As Nefertiti approached womanhood, her world would have expanded. She might have begun to attend more formal gatherings, always properly chaperoned, where young men and women of noble families could meet under watchful eyes. These occasions would have been carefully orchestrated. Perhaps a boat excursion on the Nile, a feast celebrating a successful harvest, or a religious festival where social interaction was permitted within prescribed boundaries. It was likely at one such gathering that she first encountered Amenhotep, the second son of Pharaoh Amenhotep III and Queen Tut. The young prince, not initially expected to inherit the throne, would have been educated in the traditional ways of Egyptian royalty. Their meeting, whether arranged by their families or occurring by seemingly chance circumstance, set in motion a relationship that would eventually transform Egyptian religion, art, and politics. The physical spaces of Nefertiti's childhood, the intimate courtyards of her family home, the busy streets of Akhmim, the vast expanse of the Nile, the imposing temples with their forest of columns, all contributed to her understanding of herself and her world. The sensory experiences of those early years, the play of light and shadow, the symphony of sounds from nature and human activity, the rich tapestry of scents and tastes, the varied textures of stone, wood, fabric, and water, formed the foundation upon which her later experiences would build. As we imagine Nefertiti in these formative years, we see a young woman shaped by tradition, yet perhaps already showing signs of the independence of thought that would later characterize her reign, alongside Akhenaten, the girl who watched the Nile rise and fall, who learned the ancient hieroglyphs, who observed the rituals honoring gods, whose worship stretched back to the dawn of Egyptian civilization, could not have known that she would one day participate in one of the most radical religious transformations in history. The gentle rhythms of her childhood, the daily routines, the seasonal celebrations, the yearly cycles of flood and harvest, provided a sense of security and continuity. The social environment, with its clearly defined roles and relationships, offered structure and meaning. Yet, within this traditional framework, something in Nefertiti's nature must have remained open to new possibilities, receptive to different ways of understanding the divine and humanity's relationship to it. As our thoughts continue to drift through the sands of time, we might imagine Nefertiti in a quiet moment, perhaps standing on a balcony of the royal palace at Akhetaten, watching the sun set over the Nile. The golden light would have illuminated her famous profile. The high cheekbones, the graceful neck, the full lips that have made her face one of the most recognizable in all of ancient art. What thoughts moved behind those almond-shaped eyes? Did she feel the weight of tradition she had helped to set aside? Did she wonder about the gods of her childhood? Did she ever question the path she and her husband had chosen? As you relax deeper, let us now softly explore the next chapter of this soothing biography as we imagine Nefertiti in these formative years. We see a young woman shaped by tradition, yet perhaps already showing signs of the independence of thought that would later characterize her reign, alongside Akhenaten, the girl who watched the Nile rise and fall, who learned the ancient hieroglyphs, who observed the rituals honoring gods, whose worship stretched back to the dawn of Egyptian civilization, could not have known that she would one day participate in one of the most radical religious transformations in history. The gentle rhythms of her childhood, the daily routines, the seasonal celebrations, the yearly cycles of flood and harvest, provided a sense of security and continuity. The social environment, with its clearly defined roles and relationships, offered structure and meaning. Yet, within this traditional framework, something in Nefertiti's nature must have remained open to new possibilities, receptive to different ways of understanding the divine and humanity's relationship to it. As our thoughts continue to drift through the sands of time, we might imagine Nefertiti in a quiet moment, perhaps standing on a balcony of the royal palace at Akhenaten, watching the sun set over the Nile. The golden light would have illuminated her famous profile. The high cheekbones, the graceful neck, the full lips that have made her face one of the most recognizable in all of ancient art. What thoughts moved behind those almond-shaped eyes? Did she feel the weight of tradition she had helped to set aside? Did she wonder about the gods of her childhood? Did she ever question the path she and her husband had chosen? The education of a royal woman in ancient Egypt was unlike anything we might recognize today. For young Nefertiti, learning began in the cool, shaded rooms of her childhood home, where the sounds of water gardens provided a soothing backdrop to her earliest lessons. Historians believe she may have been born into nobility, perhaps the daughter of Ai, a high official who would later become Pharaoh himself. In this nurturing environment, surrounded by the quiet luxury befitting her station, Nefertiti's curious mind would have first awakened to the world around her. In those peaceful morning hours, when the air was still cool and fresh, she would have sat beside her tutor, perhaps an elderly scribe with gentle hands and patient eyes. Together, they would trace the sacred symbols of hieroglyphic writing onto smooth pieces of limestone, practicing again and again until the characters flowed naturally from her fingers. Did she understand? Even then, the weight her name would carry through the corridors of time. Unlike many girls of her era, whose education focused primarily on domestic arts, Nefertiti's position would have granted her access to a broader range of knowledge. As the soft light filtered through latticed windows, casting dappled patterns across the floor, she would have absorbed lessons in history, religion, and proper conduct. Her tutors, noticing her quick mind and thoughtful questions, might have shared with her the stories of great queens who came before powerful women like Hatshepsut, who ruled not as queen, but as pharaoh in her own right. The rhythm of these lessons would have followed the natural pace of Egyptian days. In the cool morning hours, when minds were fresh and alert, she would have focused on reading and writing as the sun climbed higher in the sky, bringing warmth that slowed all activity. She might have turned to music, learning to play the sistrum, a sacred rattle used in religious ceremonies. The metallic chiming of this instrument would have filled her chambers as she practiced, the sound blending with the distant calls of birds along the Nile. Among her most influential teachers would have been the priestesses of the Temple of Hathor, goddess of love, music, and motherhood. These women, with their flowing linen robes and eyes lined with kohl, would have instructed Nefertiti in the sacred dances performed during religious festivals. Under their watchful guidance, she would have learned to move her body with the fluid grace that would later be immortalized in stone and paint. The steady rhythm of drums and the sweet notes of flutes would have accompanied these lessons, creating a meditative atmosphere in which Nefertiti could connect with the divine feminine energy embodied by Hathor. Religious education formed the cornerstone of Nefertiti's intellectual development. In the temples, where incense hung heavy in the air and gold leaf caught the light of oil lamps, she would have learned the complex mythology that explained the Egyptian universe, the stories of Isis and Osiris, of Ra's daily journey across the sky, of Thoth's wisdom, and Anubis's guidance of souls. These narratives would have shaped her understanding of life, death, and the cosmos. The priests, with their shaved heads and white linen robes, would have spoken in low, soothing voices as they explained the rituals that maintained cosmic order, or mad. We can imagine Nefertiti sitting quietly in these sacred spaces, absorbing not just the knowledge, but the atmosphere of reverence. Perhaps it was here, in the hushed sanctuaries where gods and humans met, that she first began to develop the spiritual sensitivity that would later make her receptive to Akhenaten's revolutionary ideas about the divine. The flickering light of oil lamps would have cast long shadows across the painted reliefs on temple walls, bringing the images of deities to life in a dance of light and dark that might have stirred something profound in her young soul. As she grew older, her education would have expanded to include the practical knowledge required of a royal woman. In the cool stillness of early evening, when the heat of the day had finally begun to subside, she might have joined the women of her household to learn the arts of cosmetics and adornment. Skilled hands would have shown her how to grind malachite for green eye paint, how to mix ochre with animal fat to create lip color, how to apply henna to her palms and the soles of her feet in intricate patterns. These were not merely beauty rituals. but sacred acts of self-creation, transforming the human into something that approached the divine. The making of perfumes would have been another essential skill for a young woman of Nefertiti's status. In rooms filled with the heady scents of lotus, myrrh, and frankincense, she would have learned to combine precious oils and resins to create fragrances that pleased the gods and evoked their presence. The slow, careful process of extracting essences from flowers and herbs would have taught her patience and precision, qualities that would serve her well in the diplomatic role she would later play as queen. Astronomy, too, would have formed part of her education. On clear, cool nights, when the stars blazed across the Egyptian sky like scattered jewels, her tutors would have led her to palace rooftops to observe the heavens. There, wrapped in linen shawls against the evening chill, they would have pointed out the constellations associated with various deities. Orion as the god Osiris, Sirius as the goddess Isis. They would have explained how the appearance of certain stars signaled the coming of the annual flood, the most important event in the Egyptian agricultural cycle. This knowledge of celestial movements and their connection to earthly events would have reinforced for Nefertiti the fundamental Egyptian belief in a cosmos where everything was interconnected, where patterns in the heavens reflected and influenced life on earth. Languages may have been another area where Nefertiti excelled. As a future royal wife, she would have needed to understand diplomatic communications from neighboring kingdoms. In the peaceful afternoon hours, when the business of the day was done, but evening had not yet fallen, she might have sat with scribes who taught her the basics of Akkadian, the international language of diplomacy in the ancient Near East. The soft murmur of foreign syllables would have filled her chamber as she practiced, perhaps already showing the linguistic aptitude that would later make her an effective partner in international relations. The development of Nefertiti's artistic sensibilities deserves special attention. The 18th dynasty, into which she was born, was a time of unprecedented artistic flowering in Egypt. The palaces and temples were filled with masterpieces of painting, sculpture, and decorative arts. Growing up surrounded by such beauty, Nefertiti would have developed a refined aesthetic sense. We can imagine her spending quiet hours in palace gardens, perhaps sketching the lotus flowers that floated on ornamental ponds, or attempting to capture the graceful forms of birds in flight. Her artistic education might have included instruction from court artists who would have recognized in the young noblewoman a genuine appreciation for their craft. Seated beside these masters, as the gentle afternoon light illuminated their work, Nefertiti would have observed techniques of proportion and perspective that had been perfected over centuries. Perhaps she even tried her hand at painting or sculpture, experiencing the meditative calm that comes from focused creative work. This early exposure to art would have prepared her to be an informed patron later in life, when she and Akhenaten would commission works in the revolutionary Amarna style that broke with artistic traditions as dramatically as their religious reforms broke with theological ones. Music and dance were essential elements of Egyptian religious and court life, and Nefertiti's education in these arts would have been thorough. In addition to the sistrum, she might have learned to play the harp, its gentle tones providing accompaniment for poetry and song. Dance instruction would have continued throughout her youth, teaching her not only the formal movements used in religious ceremonies, but also the more fluid, expressive dances performed at court celebrations. The physical discipline required for these arts would have complemented her intellectual studies, creating a harmonious balance between mind and body. As she approached marriageable age, Nefertiti's education would have increasingly focused on preparing her for her future role as a royal wife. She would have received instruction in court etiquette, learning the complex protocols that governed interaction with the pharaoh and other members of the royal family. Female relatives or trusted servants would have shared with her the intimate knowledge she would need as a wife, and eventually a mother. These conversations would have taken place in private chambers, perhaps as the women sat together working on fine linen garments, their voices low and confidential in the quiet afternoon. Throughout all these years of learning, Nefertiti was also absorbing the unspoken lessons of power, watching the interactions of nobles and officials who visited her family home, observing how influence was exercised and authority maintained. She would have developed political instincts that would serve her well in the royal court. The subtle dynamics of who spoke, who remained silent, who was consulted, and who ignored. All these would have been noted by her observant eyes and stored away in her quick mind. By the time Nefertiti met the young prince who would become Amenhotep IV and later take the name Akhenaten, she had received an education that prepared her not just to be a decorative consort, but an active partner in rulership. Her mind had been shaped by traditional Egyptian wisdom, but remained flexible enough to embrace new ideas. Her aesthetic sense had been refined by exposure to the finest art of her time, but was not bound by convention. Her spiritual understanding encompassed the rich pantheon of Egyptian deities, but perhaps already contained the seeds of the more abstract conception of divinity that would characterize the Aten cult. In this way, Nefertiti's education created a woman uniquely qualified to stand beside one of history's most enigmatic and revolutionary pharaohs. The knowledge she had acquired, the skills she had mastered, the sensibilities she had developed, all would be put to use during the extraordinary years of the Amarna period, when she and Akhenaten would attempt to transform Egyptian religion and culture in ways that still fascinate us today. As sleep begins to drift over us like the soft mists that rise from the Nile at dawn, we can imagine Nefertiti in one final scene from her educational years. Perhaps she stands alone in a temple courtyard as evening approaches, the last rays of the setting sun gilding her youthful face. In this moment of transition between day and night, she might have felt a special connection to the sun itself, a prescient glimpse of the solar deity that would later become the focus of her life with Akhenaten. As darkness gently claims the land, as the stars begin to appear in the deepening blue of the sky, we leave the young Nefertiti on the threshold of her remarkable destiny. Her mind filled with knowledge, her heart open to possibilities that no Egyptian education could have fully prepared her to embrace. Our soothing biography continues with a look at the next important period in this incredible life. Nefertiti's journey toward becoming one of Egypt's most remarkable queens was shaped by the quiet, steady guidance of mentors whose wisdom flowed into her life like the gentle currents of the Nile. From her earliest years, she was surrounded by individuals who not only taught her the practical arts of statecraft and religion, but also nurtured the deeper qualities of leadership, intuition, grace, and the courage to think in ways no royal woman had before. One of the earliest and most tender influences in Nefertiti's life was her nurse, a woman whose name has been lost to time, but whose presence lingered in the queen's memory as a source of warmth and security. In the soft glow of oil lamps, this woman would tell stories of the gods and goddesses, her voice a soothing murmur as Nefertiti drifted toward sleep. She spoke of Mad, the goddess of truth and balance, whose feather weighed lighter than a whisper in the afterlife, and of Hathor, whose music brought joy to the heavens. These tales were not just lessons in piety, but seeds of a spiritual understanding that would one day bloom into Nefertiti's devotion to the Aten. As she grew older, her formal education was placed in the hands of temple scribes and priestesses, women of quiet authority who moved through the palace like shadows, their wisdom as steady as the turning of the stars. Among them was Merit-Ta, a priestess of Isis, whose knowledge of sacred texts was matched only by her skill in healing. Under her guidance, Nefertiti learned to read the intricate hieroglyphs that adorned temple walls, tracing the stories of creation and the mysteries of the afterlife with her fingertips. But more than that, Merit-Ta taught her to listen to the whispers of the wind, the murmurs of the river, the unspoken fears of those who sought her counsel. It was a lesson Nefertiti would carry with her always, the understanding that true power lay not in command alone, but in perception. Another figure who left an indelible mark was the royal tutor, a man named Senenmut, though he was not the same famed architect who served Hatshepsut. This Senenmut was a scholar of astronomy and mathematics, his mind attuned to the silent music of the cosmos. He would take Nefertiti to the palace gardens at dusk, pointing out the slow dance of the stars, teaching her that even the gods moved in patterns as precise as the turning of a scribe's pen. This lesson in patience and trust in divine order would later comfort her during the turbulent years of religious transformation. when the old ways were set aside, and the worship of the Aten was born. But of all her mentors, none was more significant than the high priest of Amun, a man whose deep devotion to tradition was softened by an unexpected openness to new ideas. Though he served the most powerful god in Egypt, he recognized early that Nefertiti's mind was not one to be confined by dogma. In the cool shadows of Karnak's inner sanctum, he taught her the hidden meanings behind rituals, the way symbols could hold layers of truth like nested boxes of scented cedar. The gods speak in many tongues, he once told her, his voice barely above a whisper, as if sharing a secret too precious for the daylight. Sometimes they are lions, sometimes they are the wind. This idea that divinity could take forms beyond statues and sacred animals would later echo in her husband's vision of the Aten as a radiant disk whose blessings fell upon all equally. Then there was her aunt, Queen Tai, a woman whose political acumen was as sharp as the gold that adorned her arms. Though not a constant presence in Nefertiti's childhood, Tai's visits were like the rare flooding of a desert oasis, brief but transformative. She moved through the world with a regal ease, commanding respect without raising her voice, her strategies unfolding like the petals of a lotus at dawn. From her, Nefertiti learned that power could be wielded with subtlety, that a queen's influence often flowed unseen, like underground springs nourishing distant fields. Tai once took her aside during a feast, pressing a single honeyed fig into her palm. "Sweetness opens more doors than force," she murmured, her dark eyes knowing. It was a lesson Nefertiti would remember when she stood beside Akhenaten, tempering his revolutionary fervor with diplomacy. But mentors were not the only ones who shaped her. There were also the artists, sculptors, and painters who saw in her face not just beauty, but a kind of sacred geometry, the perfect balance of strength and serenity. The master sculptor Thutmose, who would later immortalize her in the famous bust, now revered as a masterpiece, once told her that true art was not about capturing likeness, but essence. "A statue must hold the soul's shadow," he said, as he worked the clay with slow, deliberate hands. This idea, that form could convey something deeper than itself, would stay with her, influencing the radical new art style of the Amarna period, where elongated limbs and flowing lines sought to express divine energy rather than earthly realism. Even the land itself was a kind of teacher. The Nile, with its endless cycles of flood and retreat, taught her that life was not linear, but rhythmic. The desert, vast and silent, showed her the power of emptiness, how absence could be as profound as presence, a concept that would later find echoes in Akhenaten's singular focus on the Aten, a god who needed no idols, only light. As the years passed, these mentors and influences wove themselves into the fabric of Nefertiti's being, their lessons settling into her bones like the layers of sediment that built the delta. By the time time she stood beside the young prince who would become her husband. She was no mere ornament to his reign, but a sovereign in her own right, her mind shaped by tradition, yet unafraid of change, her spirit as radiant and untamed as the sun she would one day worship. And so we leave her here, in the quiet hour before dawn, her thoughts lingering on the voices that had guided her, the nurse's lullabies, the priestess's wisdom, the sculptor's vision. As the first light of morning touches the horizon, she closes her eyes, not in sleep, but in readiness. For the next chapter of her life is about to unfold, and she is prepared. Let your mind float with these gentle recollections as we move forward in our story. The transition from student to sovereign was not immediate, nor was it without its quiet trials. Nefertiti's early years at court unfolded like the slow unrolling of a papyrus scroll, each line revealing new layers of responsibility, diplomacy, and artistry. She was still young when she first took her place beside Akhenaten, then known as Amenhotep IV, a prince whose own thoughts were already turning toward the sun's boundless light. But before she could stand as his equal in reshaping Egypt's spiritual landscape, she had to navigate the intricate dance of courtly life, where every gesture carried weight and every word was measured. Her first duties were subtle, almost invisible to those who did not know where to look. She attended the daily rituals in the temples, not merely as an observer, but as a participant, learning the sacred chants and the precise movements of offering. The priests, initially wary of this young queen, whose eyes held too much curiosity, soon found her to be a diligent student. She asked questions, quietly, respectfully, but her inquiries were sharp, probing the meanings behind the rituals, rather than simply memorizing their forms. It was in these early days that she first began to understand how deeply intertwined politics and religion were, how the gods were not just worshipped, but wielded, their names invoked to bless alliances or condemn enemies. One of her earliest challenges was the court's entrenched conservatism. Thebes was a city of tradition, its temples heavy with the scent of incense and the weight of centuries. The priests of Amun held power that rivaled the pharaohs, their wealth and influence woven into the very fabric of the kingdom. Nefertiti, though raised to respect the old ways, had been shaped by thinkers who questioned, who saw beyond the familiar. She knew that to challenge the priests directly would be folly, so she moved carefully, like a heron stepping through reeds, leaving barely a ripple. She began by fostering relationships with the temple's artisans, the painters who adorned the walls with hieroglyphs, the sculptors who carved the gods' likenesses. These were men and women who understood the power of symbols, and through them, she learned how to shape perception without confrontation. Her first tangible contribution came in the form of a small but significant shift in artistic representation. Traditionally, queens were depicted in poses of submission or support, their figures smaller, their roles secondary. But Nefertiti, working with the royal sculptors, began to appear in reliefs and statues with a new prominence, her stature equal to the king's, her regalia just as elaborate. It was a quiet revolution, one that did not overturn tradition so much as stretch its boundaries. The court artists, sensing the shifting winds, adapted eagerly, their chisels giving form to a new vision of power. Those early years were not without their personal struggles. There were nights when the weight of expectation pressed upon her like the heavy gold of her ceremonial collar, when the whispers of courtiers, questioning her influence, doubting her worth, reached her ears. She found solace in the gardens of the palace, where the scent of lotus blossoms floated on the evening air, and in the quiet company of her closest handmaidens, women who had known her since childhood and whose loyalty was unshakable. Among them was Meritor, a scribe's daughter with a gift for languages, who became Nefertiti's confidant and later her chief scribe, recording her words with ink as dark as the night sky. The historical context of these years was one of subtle but gathering change. Egypt was at the height of its imperial power, its borders secure, its wealth flowing in from Nubia's gold mines and the Levant's trade routes. Yet, beneath the surface, there were currents of discontent. The priesthood of Amun had grown so powerful that their authority sometimes eclipsed the thrones, and Amenhotep III, Akhenaten's father, had already begun to seek ways to rebalance the scales. Nefertiti, observing these tensions, understood that the kingdom stood at a crossroads. The old gods had brought Egypt this far, but could they carry it forward? It was in this atmosphere that she and Akhenaten began to lay the groundwork for what would become their most profound legacy, the elevation of the Aten, the sun disk, as the supreme deity. At first, their efforts were cautious. They commissioned hymns to the Aten, praising its life-giving rays, and built small shrines where the sunlight could be worshipped without the mediation of priests. Nefertiti's role in this spiritual evolution was deeply personal. She had always been drawn to the sun's clarity, its constancy, qualities she sought to embody in her own rule. Slowly, carefully, she helped to shape a theology that was as much about light as it was about power, about visibility as much as divinity. The court, of course, was not quick to embrace these changes. There were factions who saw the young queen and king as reckless, upending the order that had sustained Egypt for generations. But Nefertiti had learned from the land itself, from the Nile's patient persistence, from the desert's vast stillness. She knew that transformation could not be forced, only guided, like a river finding its course. And so, she continued her quiet work, building alliances, nurturing artists and thinkers, always with the same steady grace that had carried her from childhood to the throne. By the time the royal court moved to the new city of Akhetaten, horizon of the Aten, Nefertiti was no longer a novice navigating the currents of power, but a co-architect of a spiritual and cultural revolution. The challenges of those early years had honed her, like gold refined in the furnace, and the contributions she had made, though subtle at first, had laid the foundation for a reign that would echo through history. And as the stars began to fade above the eastern horizon, she would often pause in those quiet moments before dawn, feeling the warmth of the coming sun on her skin, knowing that each new day was another step toward the light she and Akhenaten sought to bring into the world. The journey had been slow, measured, like the turning of the seasons, and she had learned to move with its rhythm, patient as the Nile, enduring as the desert. There was still much to be done, but she was ready, her heart as open and unwavering as the sky at sunrise, drifting like clouds across the evening sky. We now move to the next part of this calming life story. In the golden city of Akhetaten, where limestone temples gleamed under the Aten's rays, and wide courtyards hummed with the murmur of prayers, Nefertiti's presence was like a quiet, steady flame. She moved through the halls of the great palace, not with the heavy tread of authority, but with the ease of one who had grown into her role. Her every gesture a reflection of the harmony she sought to cultivate. Her contributions were not loud proclamations or sudden decrees, but a slow, deliberate shaping of a new world, one where art, faith, and governance intertwined like the threads of a finely woven tapestry. One of her most enduring legacies was the transformation of Egyptian art. Before her time, depictions of royalty had been rigid, bound by centuries of tradition, faces carved in solemn stillness, bodies frozen in ritual postures. But Nefertiti, with her keen eye for beauty and her belief in the Aten's light as a force of intimacy and warmth, encouraged artists to break free from these constraints. She sat for portraits where her face was not just a mask of power, but alive with emotion, her lips curved in a knowing smile, her almond-shaped eyes soft with wisdom. Sculptors carved her likeness with such tenderness that even now, millennia later, one can almost feel the warmth of her presence radiating from the stone. This was no accident. She had spent hours in the workshops, speaking with the artisans, not as a queen issuing commands, but as a patron of their craft. She asked questions, listened, and gently guided them toward a vision where art was not merely a reflection of divinity, but an expression of life itself. The famous bust that would later become her most iconic image, now resting in quiet splendor in Berlin, was born from this collaboration. A masterpiece of realism that captured not just her beauty, but her essence. Beyond art, her influence extended into the spiritual life of the kingdom. The worship of the Aten was not merely a shift in theology, but a reimagining of the divine as something personal, accessible, where the old gods had been distant, shrouded in mystery. The Aten's light was everywhere, touching every life, every home. Nefertiti played a crucial role in this transformation, not by force, but by example. She was often seen in the open courtyards of the temples, her arms raised in prayer, bathed in sunlight, a living embodiment of the Aten's grace. She encouraged priests to speak in simpler terms, to make the new faith feel less like an imposition and more like an invitation, and slowly the people began to respond. Her methods were subtle, patient. She knew that faith could not be commanded, only inspired, so she wove the Aten's teachings into the rhythms of daily life, through festivals where music and dance celebrated the sun's gifts, through alms given to the poor in the god's name, through the very design of the city itself, where every street and plaza was aligned to catch the light at its most glorious moments. Under her guidance, the spiritual became inseparable from the ordinary, and the people of Akhenaten began to see their lives as part of something greater. In matters of state, too, she was a steadying force. Akhenaten, though visionary, could be impulsive, his mind racing ahead of his advisors, his reforms sometimes meeting resistance. Nefertiti, with her quiet diplomacy, became the bridge between his ideals and the practicalities of rule. She knew when to press forward and when to pause, when to speak and when to listen. She met with governors and scribes, not in the formal austerity of the throne room, but in the shaded gardens of the palace, where the scent of lotus blossoms softened the air, and conversation flowed more easily. Her influence was especially felt in the lives of women. She elevated female scribes and healers, ensuring that their voices were heard in matters of law and medicine. She expanded the roles of priestesses within the Aten's temples, and in doing so, she quietly reshaped the expectations of what women could achieve. It was not a sudden revolution, but a gradual unfurling, like the petals of a flower opening to the sun. And then there was her role as a mother. To her 6 daughters, she was both queen and teacher, guiding them with the same gentle firmness she brought to her rule. She ensured they were educated in languages, music, and statecraft, preparing them not just for marriage alliances, but for lives of influence. The eldest, Meritate, would eventually share in her parents' duties, a testament to Nefertiti's belief that the future of Egypt lay in the hands of those nurtured with care. As the years passed, her impact became undeniable. The city flourished, not just as a political capital, but as a beacon of culture and thought. Scholars from distant lands came to study in its libraries, artists to learn from its workshops. The hymns composed in praise of the Aten were not cold rituals, but poetry that spoke of love and light, their words echoing through the halls of history. And yet, for all her achievements, Nefertiti never lost the stillness that had guided her from the beginning. Even in moments of triumph, she would retreat to her private gardens at dusk, where the fading light painted the world in soft gold and violet. There, she would reflect, not with pride, but with a quiet gratitude for the chance to shape her world, for the love of her family, for the endless, patient cycles of the Nile and the sun. Her reign, like all things, would one day fade. The tides of history would shift, and the city she helped build would be reclaimed by the sands. But the essence of what she created, the art, the ideas, the vision of a more intimate and luminous faith would endure, carried forward like a whisper on the wind. And in those rare moments when the light falls just so on an ancient statue, or when a hymn's melody drifts up from some forgotten fragment of parchment, it is as if she is still there, guiding, inspiring, her presence as gentle and eternal as the dawn. As your breathing becomes more regular, let us continue with the next chapter of our biography. Every life, no matter how grand, is shaped by moments of quiet transformation, those delicate crossroads where a single decision alters the course of destiny. For Nefertiti, these turning points came softly, like the shifting of the Nile's currents, or the slow arc of the sun across the sky. Each choice she made, whether in the hushed halls of the palace or beneath the open expanse of the desert, wove itself into the tapestry of her legacy, guiding her toward the luminous reign she would one day embody. One such moment arrived in her early years, when she was still a young princess, untouched by the weight of rule. It was whispered that she had been chosen for her beauty, but those who knew her understood it was something deeper, an inner stillness, a wisdom beyond her years. When the proposal came for her to marry the young pharaoh Akhenaten, she could have hesitated. She could have questioned whether she was ready to step into the glare of power, to bear the expectations of a kingdom. But she did not. With quiet certainty, she accepted, sensing that this union was not merely a political alliance, but the beginning of something far greater. Had she refused, history might have known a different queen, a different Egypt. But she stepped forward, and in doing so, she set her feet upon a path that would lead to the reimagining of an empire. Another turning point came as she and Akhenaten began to reshape the spiritual heart of Egypt. The old gods had long been worshipped in shadowed temples, their rituals steeped in tradition. But Akhenaten dreamed of a new faith, one that worshipped the Aten, the radiant disk of the sun, as the supreme and singular deity. Many in the court resisted, clinging to the familiar. Nefertiti, too, might have hesitated. She might have counseled caution, fearing the unrest such a change could bring. But instead, she embraced the vision, not out of blind obedience, but with a quiet understanding of its deeper meaning. She saw in the Aten not just a god, but a symbol of light, of unity, of a world bathed in divine warmth. Together, they built a new capital, Akhetaten, a city of open courtyards and sunlit sanctuaries, where the hymns to the Aten were not chanted in solemn monotony, but sung like love songs to the heavens. There were moments, of course, when the weight of such change pressed heavily upon her. The priests of Amen, stripped of their power, murmured in discontent. The people, though awed by the splendor of the new city, sometimes longed for the old ways. Nefertiti could have wavered then. She could have softened the reforms, allowed the old gods to linger in the shadows. But she held firm, not with force, but with quiet conviction, she understood that true transformation required patience. That light, once kindled, could not be easily extinguished. And so she walked among her people, her presence a calming reassurance, her voice a steady guide. Perhaps the most profound turning point came in the later years of her reign, when Akhenaten's health began to falter, and whispers of succession stirred the court. Some expected her to retreat, to let the traditional structures of power take over, but Nefertiti, ever perceptive, recognized that the vision she and her husband had nurtured was fragile, still in need of her steady hand. And so, with a grace that belied the enormity of the moment, she stepped forward as co-regent, then as sole ruler in all but name. It was an unprecedented step, a woman ruling with the full authority of a pharaoh. Had she chosen otherwise, had she allowed the old guard to reclaim control, the Aten's light might have faded into obscurity, its hymns forgotten, but she did not. She carried the vision forward, ensuring that the city they had built, the faith they had kindled, would endure a little longer. In the quiet of her gardens, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she must have reflected on these choices, the paths taken, the roads left untraveled. What if she had never embraced Akhenaten's vision? Egypt might have remained bound to the old gods, its art static, its rituals unchanged. What if she had faltered when the priests resisted? The Aten's light might have been snuffed out before it could truly shine. What if she had stepped aside when her husband's strength waned? The reforms might have unraveled, the city left unfinished, but she had chosen again and again to move forward, to trust in the light. And so her life unfolded, not as a series of dramatic upheavals, but as a quiet, unwavering journey, each decision a ripple in the great river of time, each moment of courage a stone laid upon the path. Even as the years passed and the sands began to reclaim Akhenaten, even as the old ways slowly returned, the essence of what she had built remained. The art she had inspired, with its flowing lines and tender depictions of family life, would influence generations. The hymns to the Aten, though no longer sung in temples, would echo in the hearts of those who sought a more personal, intimate connection with the divine. And when at last her time in this world came to an end, she left as she had lived, with quiet grace. The kingdom would change, the tides of history would turn, but the light she had helped to kindle would never fully fade. Even now, when the dawn breaks over the Nile, painting the water in gold and rose, it is as if she is still there, her presence woven into the very fabric of the world, a reminder that even the smallest choices, made with courage and quiet conviction, can shape the course of eternity. So let us rest now, soothed by the thought that even the grandest of lives are built upon moments of stillness, of gentle decisions made in the hush of dusk. And as sleep draws near, may we too trust in the light, knowing that our own paths, though humble, are part of something far greater, just as Nefertiti once knew. Beneath the endless, patient cycles of the sun, the calming story continues, as we gently examine what happened next in this remarkable journey. The relationships that shaped Nefertiti's life were like the gentle currents of the Nile, sometimes flowing smoothly, sometimes shifting course, but always carrying her forward with quiet purpose. At the heart of these connections was her bond with Akhenaten, a love that began as a political alliance, but deepened into something far more profound. In the early days, when they were still young and unburdened by the weight of kingship, they would walk together in the palace gardens, speaking in hushed tones about their dreams for Egypt. She admired his fierce devotion to the art, and he, in turn, was drawn to her quiet wisdom. The way she could unravel the most tangled of court intrigues with a single thoughtful glance. Their love was not without its strains. There were moments when his zeal for reform clashed with her more measured approach, when the pressures of ruling threatened to pull them apart, but always they found their way back to one another. Their shared vision of a world bathed in the light of the sun disk, binding them together, even in the darkest of times. Then there were her daughters, the 6 princesses who filled her life with laughter and light. She would often sit with them in the cool of the evening, brushing their hair as they told her stories of their day, their voices soft and sweet like the rustling of papyrus. Meritaten, the eldest, was her father's shadow, eager to learn the ways of governance, while Meketaten, the most spirited, could often be found climbing the palace walls, her laughter ringing through the courtyards. Nefertiti cherished these small, ordinary moments. The way Enkisenpat would curl into her lap after a nightmare. The way Neferneferuit would hum to herself while weaving garlands of flowers, even when the weight of her duties grew heavy. Their presence reminded her of what truly mattered. Beyond her family, there were the friendships that sustained her, relationships woven with threads of trust and mutual respect. Chief among them was her bond with the sculptor Thutmose, the man who would immortalize her in stone. They spent countless hours in his workshop, the air thick with the scent of chiseled limestone, as he captured the curve of her smile, the quiet strength in her gaze. He was one of the few who saw her not just as a queen, but as a woman, someone who could laugh at a misplaced chisel stroke, who could sit in companionable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was in those quiet hours that she felt most at peace, away from the demands of the throne, simply being. And then there was Tut, her mother-in-law, a woman whose wisdom was as deep as the Nile's waters. In the early years of her marriage, Nefertiti had been wary of the elder queen, uncertain of her place in the intricate web of court politics. But Tut, with her sharp eyes and gentle hands, had welcomed her with a warmth that surprised her. They would sit together in the shade of the palace colonnades, sipping cool pomegranate juice, as Tut shared stories of her own youth, of the mistakes she had made, and the lessons she had learned. It was Tut who taught her the art of patience, who showed her that true power often lay not in confrontation, but in knowing when to wait, when to listen. tensions arose between Akhenaten and the priests of Amun, it was Te's counsel that guided Nefertiti's steady hand, her voice a calming presence in the storm. Not all relationships were so harmonious, of course. There were moments of quiet friction with the noblewomen of the court, women who resented her influence, who whispered behind their jeweled hands that she had risen too far, too fast. Nefertiti learned to navigate these currents with grace, offering kindness where she could, standing firm where she must. She understood that envy was often born of fear, and so she made a point of seeking out those who seemed most distant, inviting them to walk with her in the gardens, to share their thoughts beneath the dappled light of the sycamore trees. Slowly, over time, many of these tensions eased, softened by the quiet persistence of her compassion. But perhaps the most unexpected of her connections was with the common people of Akhenaten. Unlike previous queens, who remained distant figures, veiled in mystery, Nefertiti made a point of walking among them, of listening to their stories as they worked the fields or tended their market stalls. She knew the names of the children who played in the dusty streets, remembered the ailments of the elderly, and made sure the palace physicians attended to them. In return, they loved her not as a distant goddess, but as a woman who cared, whose presence brought comfort. On festival days, when the city was alive with music and color, she would join the celebrations, her laughter mingling with theirs, her hands stained with henna, just like any other woman's. It was in these moments, far from the glittering throne, that she felt most alive. As the years passed, some relationships faded, as all things must. Te's passing left a quiet void, though her lessons remained, etched into Nefertiti's heart like hieroglyphs on temple walls. Thutmose, too, grew older, his hands less steady, though his eyes still sparkled when she visited. And Akhenaten, her beloved, her partner in all things, became more withdrawn, his health declining as the burdens of kingship took their toll. Yet even in those final days, when words were scarce and silence heavy between them, their bond endured. She would sit by his side, her fingers laced with his, the warmth of their shared years, a comfort against the gathering dark. In the end, it was these connections that defined her, that shaped the legacy she left behind. Not just the grand temples or the sweeping reforms, but the quiet moments, the way she held her daughters close after a nightmare, the way she listened to a farmer's worries as if they were her own, the way she could make even the weariest of courtiers feel seen. These were the threads that wove through her life, stitching together a tapestry of love and loyalty that would endure long after the sands had reclaimed her city. And so, as the stars blink softly over the Nile, as the night wraps its gentle arms around the world, let us remember that it is in these small, tender connections that the truest kind of greatness is found. Just as Nefertiti once did, may we too find solace in the bonds we share, in the quiet love that lingers long after the words have faded. And as sleep draws near, May we rest in the knowledge that even the briefest of moments, when touched by kindness, can ripple outward into eternity, just as hers did, beneath the endless, patient cycles of the sun. Allow yourself to sink deeper into comfort as we explore the next phase of this soothing biography. Nefertiti's days, though filled with the weight of rule and ritual, were also shaped by the quiet rhythms of her private world, a world where she could simply be, beyond the expectations of queenship. In the early mornings, before the sun had fully risen over the Nile, she would often steal a few moments alone on her balcony, wrapped in a sheer linen shawl, watching the river's slow, silver currents. The air was cool then, carrying the faint scent of lotus blossoms and damp earth, and she would breathe it in deeply, as if storing its peace for the hours ahead. Sometimes she would press her palms against the smooth stone railing, grounding herself in the stillness, a small ritual to remind her that even queens were part of the earth's endless turning. Her mornings often began with her daughters Meritate, Mekatate, Anchisenpot, and the younger ones, their laughter like sunlight spilling through the palace halls. She would join them as they broke their fast, listening to their chatter. The way Mekatate would excitedly recount her dreams, or Anchisenpot would carefully arrange her figs into little patterns on her plate, Nefertiti made certain that, no matter how pressing her duties, these moments were undisturbed. She would brush their hair herself, her fingers moving gently through the strands, humming an old lullaby her own mother had once sung to her. There was a softness in these routines, a tenderness that balanced the formality of court life when the girls were occupied with their tutors or play. She would retreat to her private garden, a sanctuary of shade and greenery, where the only sounds were the rustle of palm fronds and the occasional trill of a songbird. Here, she tended to her plants with the same care she gave her children, plucking away withered leaves, guiding vines along trellises, sprinkling water from a clay jug onto the roots of her favorite herbs. She had a particular fondness for blue lotus, its petals unfolding like delicate cups of sky, and for the fragrant chamomile that grew in little clusters near the fountain. Sometimes she would pluck a blossom and tuck it behind her ear, its scent lingering as she moved through her day. In the afternoons, when the heat pressed heavily upon the city, she would often seek out Thutmose, the aging sculptor who had once shaped her likeness with such reverence. His workshop was cool and dim, the air thick with the smell of clay and cedar oil. Though his hands were no longer as steady as they had been in his prime, his eyes still brightened when she entered, and they would talk for hours of art, of the old gods, of the small, fleeting beauties of life. He had known her since her girlhood, and there was a comfort in his presence, a sense of being truly seen. Sometimes she would even take up a piece of clay herself, shaping it absently as they spoke, her fingers remembering the motions she had learned as a child. Her bond with Akhenaten, though strained in later years by the burdens of rule and his declining health, remained the quiet center of her world. Even when words failed them, there were other ways they spoke, a brush of fingers as they passed in the hall, the way he would save the sweetest dates for her from his plate, the silent understanding that passed between them during court ceremonies, a glance that said more than any decree. In the evenings, when the palace grew hushed, they would sometimes sit together on the rooftop terrace, sharing a cup of spiced wine, watching the stars emerge one by one over Amarna. She would lean into him, her head resting against his shoulder, and for those moments, there was no kingdom to rule, no weight upon them, just the simplicity of being two souls beneath the same sky. Nefertiti found solace, too, in the company of her handmaidens, women who had been with her since her earliest days as queen. They moved around her with quiet efficiency, but their relationship was far more than servitude. They were her confidants, her allies, the keepers of her unguarded moments. In the late afternoons, they would often gather in her chambers, weaving or mending garments together. The rhythmic click of their needles, a soothing backdrop to their murmured conversations. She listened to their stories, their joys, their sorrows, the small dramas of their families. And though she rarely spoke of her own burdens, they knew, in the way she sometimes paused to press a hand to her temple, or the faraway look in her eyes, when the weight of the crown grew heavy, music was another refuge. She had learned to play the harp as a girl, and though she rarely performed publicly, she would sometimes draw the instrument close in the privacy of her rooms, letting the strings hum beneath her fingers. The melodies she chose were often old ones, passed down through generations, songs of the Nile's bounty or the love of Hathor. Other times, she would simply listen as her musicians played, losing herself in the rise and fall of the notes, the way the sound seemed to soften the edges of the world. Her faith, though shaped by the radical changes Akhenaten had brought to Egypt, remained a deeply personal thing. She honored Aten, yes, but she also kept small tokens of the old gods hidden in her chambers, a figurine of Isis, a scarab amulet of Khepri, not out of defiance, but from a quiet understanding that the divine could not be contained in a single form. At night, before sleep took her, she would light a single lamp and whisper prayers, not for power or glory, but for the strength to meet the next day with grace, for the health of her children, for the soul of her departed mother, whose presence she still felt in the whisper of the wind through the reeds. And then there were the nights when sleep eluded her, when the worries of rule or the ache of loss pressed too closely. On those nights, she would rise and walk the palace corridors, her bare feet silent on the cool stone. The guards knew better than to disturb her, and so she would wander past the darkened halls of the treasury, through the shadowed courtyards where the moonlight pooled like liquid silver. Sometimes she would stop at the nursery just to watch her daughters sleep, their chests rising and falling in perfect peace. Other times, she would step out into the gardens, where the night-blooming flowers unfurled their petals in secret, their perfume thick in the still air. she would tilt her face to the stars and breathe, reminding herself that even queens were part of something vast, something eternal. In these small, unremarkable moments, the brush of a daughter's cheek against her palm, the scent of herbs crushed between her fingers, the sound of a friend's laughter, Nefertiti found the threads that wove her life together, not in the grand proclamations or the towering monuments, but in the quiet, everyday acts of love and presence. And as the years unfolded, as joys and sorrows came and went like the Nile's tides, it was these threads that held her, that reminded her, even in the darkest hours, of the beauty that could be found in simply being alive. So let us imagine her now, not as the iconic queen of countless carvings, but as a woman standing in the golden light of late afternoon, her fingers trailing in the water of the palace fountain, her face turned toward the sound of her children's laughter. Let us remember her as she was in these unguarded moments, tender, weary, joyful, human. And in doing so, may we too find permission to embrace the quiet, ordinary magic of our own lives. And as the night deepens, as sleep's gentle tide draws nearer, may we rest in the knowledge that even the greatest of legacies are built, not on stone, but on the countless small acts of love that ripple outward endlessly, like the Nile's own eternal flow, like a gentle river flowing toward the sea. Our story continues with the next meaningful chapter. The rhythm of Nefertiti's days was as steady as the Nile's current, flowing from dawn to dusk in a quiet, unhurried cadence. Her mornings began with the first light, when the sun still lingered below the horizon, painting the sky in pale hues of gold and rose. She would stir beneath the fine linen sheets, her body attuned to the world's waking breath, and rise before her attendants arrived. In these hushed moments, she would stand by the open window, letting the cool morning air brush against her skin, listening to the distant sounds of the city stirring, the murmur of priests at the temple, the soft clatter of pots in the palace kitchens, the first bird song threading through the date palms. Her bathing ritual was a quiet luxury. Servants would bring warm water scented with lotus and myrrh, pouring it over her shoulders in slow, soothing streams. The scent would cling to her skin, mingling with the oils rubbed into her arms and neck, frankincense for clarity, jasmine for calm, as her attendants combed through her hair, weaving in golden beads and delicate ribbons. She would close her eyes and let the rhythm of their hands lull her into a gentle readiness for the day ahead. Breakfast was a simple affair. Flatbread drizzled with honey, ripe figs bursting with sweetness, cooled barley beer in a polished copper cup. She ate lightly, savoring each bite, often sharing the meal with her daughters as they tumbled into her chambers, still drowsy-eyed and wrapped in the warmth of sleep. Their laughter was the best part of her morning, their small hands reaching for fruit, their voices bright with stories from their dreams. The heart of her day was spent in the sunlit chamber where she conducted her duties. The room was airy, its walls painted with scenes of reeds and waterfowl. The floor spread with woven mats dyed in soft blues and greens. Here, she would sit on a low-backed chair, her writing palette balanced on her lap, a smooth wooden board lined with cakes of ink, red and black, and a reed pen tucked neatly beside them. Scrolls of papyrus, some fresh, others carefully rolled and sealed, lay in baskets at her feet. She would read petitions, dictate letters, listen to reports from her advisors, her voice measured, her decisions deliberate. The scratching of the pen against paper was a soft, steady sound, like the whisper of reeds in the wind. Midday brought a pause, a retreat from the weight of rule. She would walk through the palace gardens, where lotus blossoms floated on the surface of shallow pools, and the shade of sycamore trees offered respite from the sun's growing heat. Sometimes she would sit beneath the trees with her closest companions, sharing bowls of pomegranate seeds and spiced wine, their conversation meandering like the garden's little streams. Other times, she preferred solitude, trailing her fingers along the petals of blooming flowers, watching bees dart from blossom to blossom in their tireless dance. The afternoon was often given to artistry. Nefertiti loved to oversee the work of sculptors and painters, to stand in the workshops where the air smelled of clay and pigment. She would run her hands over half-carved statues, feeling the curves of a cheek or the line of a brow taking shape beneath her fingertips. Her own hands were skilled. She would sometimes take up a brush to add delicate strokes to a fresco, or shape a small amulet from wax to be cast in gold. The craftsmen worked in quiet harmony around her, the tap of chisels and the murmur of their voices blending into a soothing hum. As evening approached, she would return to her chambers to prepare for the night's rituals. The setting sun painted the walls in deep amber, and the scent of evening meals drifted through the halls. Roasted duck with coriander, lentils simmered with garlic, warm bread fresh from the ovens. Dinner was a leisurely affair, shared with her family. The low table spread with dishes, the flicker of oil lamps casting soft shadows. The children would chatter about their day, their words tumbling over one another, while Nefertiti listened, her heart full, her hands occasionally reaching to smooth a tousled head or brush a crumb from a small chin. When the stars emerged, she would kneel before her private shrine, lighting cones of incense that curled into the air like delicate threads. The scent of kaifi, sweet and resinous, made from raisins, honey, and pine, would fill the room as she whispered prayers of gratitude, her fingers tracing the carved edges of a statue of Hathor, the goddess of love and motherhood. Then, at last, she would slip beneath her sheets, the linen cool against her skin, the weight of the day's jewels set aside. But there were nights, as we know, when sleep did not come easily. On those nights, she would rise and wander, her bare feet silent on the stone, her thoughts as restless as the Nile's currents. She would walk until weariness softened her edges, until the hush of the palace and the scent of night-blooming flowers lulled her back to bed. And when sleep finally claimed her, it was with the knowledge that dawn would come again, steady and sure, bringing with it another day of small, beautiful moments, each one a thread in the tapestry of her life. So let us imagine her now, not in grandeur, but in quietude, a woman who found joy in the taste of honey, in the sound of her children's laughter, in the brush of a breeze through an open window. And as we follow the gentle rhythm of her days, may we too be reminded of the peace that lies in the ordinary, in the steady, unhurried flow of a life well lived. And as the night deepens around us, as our own eyelids grow heavy, may we drift into sleep with the same quiet grace, carried by the certainty that even the grandest of lives are made beautiful not by monuments, but by moments. As your thoughts grow quieter, we'll continue our peaceful exploration of this fascinating life. Nefertiti's philosophy was woven into the very fabric of her days, as subtle and enduring as the golden threads in the tapestries that adorned her chambers. She believed, above all, in balance, not just the balance of mad, the cosmic order her people revered, but a quieter, more personal harmony between duty and joy, between power and tenderness. Her worldview was shaped like the river that sustained her land, deep, patient, and nourishing, flowing with quiet certainty toward its purpose. In her youth, she had been taught that a queen's role was to reflect the will of the gods, to stand as a living embodiment of grace and authority. But as she grew, she came to understand that true wisdom lay not in rigid adherence to tradition, but in the spaces between the moments where instinct and compassion could soften the edges of rule. To her, leadership was not about dominance, but about listening to the whispers of her people, to the rustle of the reeds along the Nile, even to the silence of the desert at dusk. Her faith was deeply personal, a quiet conversation with the divine that unfolded in the privacy of dawn or the hush of midnight. While her husband, Akhenaten, championed the worship of Aten, the sun disk, Nefertiti's spirituality was more intimate. She found the divine in the small things, the way light pooled like honey on the temple steps, the laughter of her children at play, the scent of lotus blossoms floating in a bowl of water. This belief guided her actions, reminding her that even in the grandeur of her station, she was but one thread in a vast and sacred tapestry. Her values were rooted in the idea of legacy, not just the towering monuments or the chiseled inscriptions that would endure for ages, but the quieter imprints left on the hearts of those she loved. She believed that kindness, like the waters of the Nile, could nourish long after it had passed. There is a story told by one of her handmaidens of a time when Nefertiti, disguised in simple linen, walked among the farmers along the riverbanks, listening to their struggles. When she returned to the palace, she ordered grain stores to be opened for the hungriest among them. A kingdom is only as strong as its most weary laborer, she had murmured, her voice as soft as the evening breeze. As the years unfolded, her philosophy deepened, shaped by both joy and sorrow. The loss of a child taught her that grief could be as much a part of wisdom as triumph. She would often retreat to her gardens in those days, sitting among the flowering jasmine, her fingers tracing the petals as if they held answers. Even the most beautiful blooms must fall, she once said to a grieving mother who had come to her for comfort. Her words carried the weight of lived experience, a reminder that resilience was not the absence of pain, but the quiet strength to grow around it. In her later years, she became a custodian of memory, collecting stories like precious stones. She would sit with the elders of the court, listening to tales of the past, knowing that history was not just etched in stone, but carried in the voices of those who had lived it. A story untold is a life unlived, she would say, her eyes reflecting the flicker of the oil lamps. She encouraged scribes to record not only the deeds of kings, but the songs of the farmers, the lullabies of the mothers, the jokes of the bakers, because to her, these were the true heartbeat of Egypt. Nefertiti's legacy was not just in the grand reforms or the iconic bust that would outlast empires, but in the way she taught those around her to see the world with wonder, with grace, with an understanding that even the mightiest river begins with a single drop of rain. She lived by the belief that every moment, no matter how small, was sacred. And as the stars wheeled slowly overhead, as the incense curled toward the heavens, she would breathe in the stillness, knowing that a life well lived was not measured in years, but in the depth of its kindness, the warmth of its light. And so, as the night wraps around us like a soft shroud, as our thoughts grow slow and heavy, we can imagine her still, sitting by an open window, watching the moon glide across the sky, her heart as steady as the river that carried her people. And in that quietude, we too may find solace, drifting into dreams with the gentle certainty that the most enduring truths are often the simplest. That love outlasts stone, that kindness echoes beyond words, and that peace, like sleep, comes when we surrender to the quiet rhythm of the world, with each breath becoming slower and deeper. Let us turn to another aspect of this soothing story. Even in the most luminous of lives, shadows must fall soft and fleeting at times, deep and lingering at others. Nefertiti's path, though illuminated by her grace and wisdom, was not without its trials. The challenges she faced shaped her as surely as the Nile's current shapes the land, carving patience into her spirit and resilience into her heart. In the early years of her reign beside Akhenaten, whispers slithered through the halls of Thebes like desert winds. The radical shift to the worship of Aten, the sun disk, unsettled the priests of Amun, whose power had long been woven into the fabric of Egypt. The temples that had once hummed with the chants of 1,000 voices grew quiet, their corridors empty, their altars cold. Some called it progress, others heresy. Nefertiti, standing at the center of this storm, felt the weight of change pressing upon her shoulders, yet she did not flinch. Instead, she walked among the people, her voice steady as she explained the beauty of Autumn's light, how it touched every life, from the highest official to the humblest laborer in the fields. She spoke of unity, of a love that did not discriminate. And though the resistance did not vanish, her calm presence soothed the sharpest edges of fear. Then came the years of drought, when the Nile's waters did not rise as they should, when the earth cracked like an old woman's hands, and the grain stores dwindled. The people grew restless, their hunger a living thing that prowled the streets. Nefertiti, who had always believed in the sacredness of sustenance, ordered the royal granaries opened. She stood beside the bakers as they worked through the night, ensuring that no child went to sleep with an empty belly. It was during these long, quiet vigils that she learned the true meaning of leadership, not in grand decrees from a golden throne, but in the sharing of bread, in the silent understanding that a ruler's strength is measured by the well-being of the weakest among them. There were personal sorrows, 2 losses that no crown could shield her from. The death of her young daughter, Nefertiti, left a hollow space in her heart, a silence where laughter had once danced. In the cool stillness of the burial chamber, Nefertiti knelt beside the small, linen-wrapped form, her tears falling like the first drops of rain after a long drought. She did not hide her grief, nor did she let it consume her. Instead, she channeled it into art, commissioning paintings and carvings that celebrated her daughter's brief, bright life. She whispered to the sculptors to capture the curl of Nefertiti's smile, the way she had clutched her favorite wooden doll. In this way, Nefertiti taught those around her that sorrow need not be buried, that it could be transformed, like sunlight, into gold. Even the stability of her marriage was not immune to the tides of time. Akhenaten, once her partner in both love and vision, grew distant, his mind consumed by his religious reforms, and some say the weight of his own doubts. The court buzzed with rumors, the air thick with unspoken tension. Yet Nefertiti did not retreat into bitterness. She turned instead to the quiet wisdom of the river, how it bends but does not break, how it flows around obstacles without losing its course. She focused on her daughters, on the small acts of governance that still needed her touch. And when the time came for her to step forward as co-regent, ruling in her own right under the name Nefertiti, she did so with a quiet strength that silenced even the most skeptical voices. Perhaps the greatest challenge came in the years after her reign, when the old ways began to creep back, when the names of Akhenaten and Nefertiti were scratched from monuments, their legacy nearly erased by those who wished to forget the upheaval they had brought. But memory, as Nefertiti knew, is a stubborn thing. It lingers in the stories told by firelight, in the songs sung by mothers to their children. Though her statues were toppled, her city abandoned to the sands, her essence could not be so easily undone. The artists who had once carved her likeness remembered the curve of her cheek, the regal tilt of her chin. The farmers who had once eaten bread from her stores spoke her name in gratitude, even when it was no longer safe to do so aloud. And so, as the years unspooled like thread from a spindle, Nefertiti's trials became part of her tapestry, not as flaws, but as patterns that gave depth to her story. She had learned that power is fragile, that love is both a balm and a wound, that even the most carefully laid plans may shift like desert sands. But she had also learned that endurance is not about never faltering, but about rising each time you do, that the most profound wisdom often grows in the soil of hardship. Now, as the night deepens and the stars blink slowly above, we can imagine her reflecting on these lessons, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her breath as even as the river at dawn. She would not have called herself fearless, for she knew the taste of fear. She would not have claimed perfection, for she had felt the sting of failure. But she would have said, in that soft, measured voice of hers, that every struggle had been a teacher, every setback a hidden gift, and as sleep tugs gently at your own eyelids, as the weight of the day begins to dissolve, you might take comfort in knowing that even queens faced storms, and that it was in the weathering of them that they found their true strength, the same strength that lives in you, quiet and unshaken, ready to carry you through the dark and into the light of a new dawn. The tapestry of this remarkable life unfolds further as we gently explore the next meaningful period beneath the golden veneer of Nefertiti's queenship, beneath the weight of her crown and the grandeur of her public duties. There existed a quieter, more intimate world, one where she was not just a ruler, but a woman with hidden passions, unexpected quirks, and private joys. The history books speak of her power, her beauty, her influence beside Akhenaten, but they seldom whisper of the small, tender details that made her human. Imagine her, not on a throne, but in the soft light of her private chambers, where the scent of lotus oil lingered in the air. Here, away from the eyes of courtiers and priests, she allowed herself moments of quiet indulgence. She had a fondness for music, not just the grand hymns sung in temples, but the delicate plucking of a harp played by one of her handmaidens in the evening. Sometimes, when the palace grew still, she would hum along, her voice a low, soothing melody, like the wind brushing through reeds along the Nile. Few knew that she possessed a talent for sketching. On scraps of papyrus, she would trace the curve of a bird's wing, the slope of a servant's shoulder, the way sunlight fell across the courtyard in the late afternoon. These were not the formal, rigid portraits of court artists, but quick, fluid lines that captured fleeting moments. She kept them tucked away in a small cedar box, a secret gallery of ordinary beauty. Once, when her youngest daughter fell asleep in her lap, Nefertiti sketched the child's relaxed fingers, the way her tiny fist curled against her cheek. That drawing, more than any official likeness, held the truth of her love. She also had a curious fascination with perfumes, not just as adornments, but as alchemy. She would often sit with her perfumers, blending oils and resins, testing combinations, until she found one that evoked a memory, the sharp green scent of crushed herbs after rain, the warm sweetness of dates drying in the sun. Her favorite was a delicate blend of jasmine and myrrh, light enough to wear in the heat of the day, but deep enough to linger into the evening. She once joked that if she had not been born a queen, she might have been a perfumer, losing herself in the mysteries of scent. And then there was her love of gardens. While the royal gardeners tended to the grand, symmetrical plots meant to impress visitors, Nefertiti had a small, private corner where she grew herbs and flowers not for show, but for pleasure. She would run her fingers through the leaves of mint, inhaling its freshness, or watch as bees drifted lazily from bloom to bloom. In the early mornings, before the palace awoke, she would sometimes walk barefoot along the damp paths, feeling the earth beneath her feet, a rare moment of simplicity. But perhaps the most surprising thing about her was her sense of humor. The Nefertiti of statues and reliefs is solemn, regal, untouchable. But those closest to her knew she had a playful side. She enjoyed riddles and word games, often teasing her scribes with clever twists of language. Once, when a visiting dignitary presented her with an overly formal speech, she responded with a pun so perfectly timed that the entire court burst into laughter, though the dignitary, baffled, never quite understood the joke. She was not without contradictions. For all her grace, she had moments of impatience, especially when faced with incompetence. She could silence a room with a single raised eyebrow, yet she was also known to bend the rules for those she loved. When one of her daughters scraped her knee, Nefertiti dismissed protocol and carried the child herself, whispering reassurances as she walked, ignoring the murmurs of disapproval from those who believed a queen should never lower herself so. She feared the dark, though she would never admit it. As a child, she had been plagued by nightmares of vast, endless voids, and even as an adult, she preferred to sleep with a single lamp burning low. Sometimes, when the anxieties of rulership pressed too heavily, she would slip into the temple at night and sit before the statues of the gods, not to pray for power or victory, but simply for the comfort of their presence. And she loved stories, not the grand epics of kings and conquests, but the small tales of ordinary people, the baker who saved a handful of grain to feed a stray cat, the fisherman who sang to his nets as he worked. She would listen to these stories from her servants, her eyes soft with understanding. And sometimes she would retell them to her children at bedtime, her voice a gentle lullaby weaving through the night. In these quiet, unguarded moments, Nefertiti was not a figure of stone or history, but a woman who cherished the fragile, fleeting beauty of life. She knew the weight of crowns, but she also knew the joy of a shared laugh, the peace of a garden at dawn, the comfort of a hand held in the dark. And as you drift toward sleep now, imagine her not as a distant queen, but as someone who, like you, sought small moments of happiness amidst the weight of her days. Someone who understood that strength is not just in ruling kingdoms, but in appreciating the scent of a flower, the sound of a loved one's voice, the quiet hum of the world at rest. Let these thoughts wrap around you like the gentlest of blankets. And know that even the greatest figures of history were, in their own way, as beautifully imperfect as anyone. And with that, may you slip into dreams as soft and deep as the sands of Egypt, carried on the same quiet currents that once cradled Nefertiti herself. As you settle more comfortably, our narrative flows onward like soft moonlight across still waters. Imagine, if you will, the golden light of an Egyptian dawn stretching across the Nile, painting the water in shimmering hues of amber and rose. It is the 14th century BCE, a time when the world moved at the measured pace of the river's current, and Egypt stood as a beacon of power, art, and spirituality. This was the world Nefertiti was born into, a world of towering temples, whispered prayers, and the ever-present hum of life along the fertile banks of the Nile. Her story unfolds during the 18th dynasty, a period of unmatched prosperity and cultural flourishing. Egypt was the heart of the ancient world, its influence stretching far beyond its borders, trading with distant lands like Punt for incense, with the Aegean for fine pottery, and with Nubia for gold. The pharaohs of this era were not just rulers, but divine intermediaries, believed to bridge the gap between gods and mortals. It was into this world of grandeur and sacred duty that Nefertiti stepped, a woman who would become not just a queen, but a symbol of an era. Her husband, Akhenaten, was a pharaoh unlike any before him. He sought to reshape Egypt's spiritual landscape, turning away from the traditional pantheon of gods centered around Amun-Ra, and instead elevating the sun disk, Aten, as the supreme deity. This was not merely a religious shift, but a cultural revolution, one that rippled through art, architecture, and daily life. Where once temples had been shadowed and mysterious, Akhenaten's new capital, Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna, was bathed in open sunlight, its courtyards and altars designed to welcome the rays of Aten. Nefertiti stood beside him in this transformation, her image carved into the very stones of this new vision. Unlike queens before her, she was not a silent figure in the background, but an active participant in rituals, often depicted in poses of power, smiting enemies, offering blessings, or standing equal to her husband beneath the sun's gaze. The art of the Amarna period softened, became more fluid, capturing intimate moments, parents playing with their children, the royal couple in tender embraces, the natural curves of the human form celebrated rather than idealized. In these carvings and paintings, we see not just a queen, but a woman alive with presence. Her famous bust, now resting in Berlin's News Museum, capturing the delicate arch of her neck, the quiet confidence in her gaze. Yet for all the grandeur, life in ancient Egypt was still bound by the rhythms of nature. The Nile's annual flood dictated the seasons, its waters bringing fertile silt to the fields, ensuring bread and beer for the people, lotus blossoms for the temples, and offerings for the gods. Even in the royal court, the scent of baking bread would have mingled with the fragrance of myrrh. The sound of scribes' pens scratching on papyrus blending with the distant laughter of children playing in the courtyards. Nefertiti's world was one of contrasts, the weight of divinity balanced with the simplicity of human joys. She would have known the coolness of linen against her skin in the desert heat, the taste of dates and honey on her tongue, the sound of hymns rising at dusk as lamps were lit in Aten's temples. And though history remembers her as a queen of revolution, she was also a mother. 6 daughters are known to us through inscriptions, their names echoing like whispers: Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankesenpaten, Neferneferuiten, Tasherit, Neferneferir, and Setapener. Beyond Egypt's borders, the world was shifting. The Hittites grew in power to the north, the Mitanni kingdom waned, and trade routes hummed with the movement of goods and ideas. But in the heart of Akhenaten, time seemed to slow, wrapped in the golden light of Aten's blessing. For a brief, luminous moment, Nefertiti and Akhenaten's vision held sway, until, as all things do, the tides of change returned. After Akhenaten's death, the old gods were restored, the capital abandoned, and the sands slowly reclaimed the city of the sun disk. Nefertiti's own end remains a mystery. Some say she ruled as a pharaoh in her own right, under the name Neferneferuiten. Others that she faded into obscurity, but the legacy of her presence lingers, not just in stone, but in the quiet truth that even those who shape history are, at their core, human, seeking love, comfort, and moments of peace beneath the same sun that still rises millennia later over the Nile. As you drift now, let the image of her world cradle you, the murmur of the river, the warmth of the sun on stone, the soft rustle of palm leaves in the evening breeze. And just as Nefertiti once closed her eyes to rest in the heart of a civilization now dust, may you too slip gently into dreams, carried on the timeless current of history's quiet embrace. Let the rhythm of these words carry you further into relaxation as we continue our peaceful journey. Nefertiti's influence rippled through the very fabric of ancient Egypt like the slow, meandering currents of the Nile, shaping not just the art and religion of her time, but the way power itself was perceived. Long before her name was whispered in history books, she stood at the center of a revolution, both spiritual and cultural, that altered the course of an entire civilization. In the golden city of Akhenaten, where sunlight spilled over white limestone and painted walls hummed with life, she was more than a queen. She was a symbol, a force, a presence that could not be ignored. Her impact began with the most visible of changes, the art that adorned temples and palaces. Before Akhenaten's reign, Egyptian art followed rigid conventions, figures carved in strict profile, their forms idealized and unchanging. But in the new world Nefertiti helped create, art became fluid, intimate, almost alive. The famous bust of her, discovered centuries later in the ruins of Amarna, captures this shift perfectly. Her regal neck arched, her lips faintly curved in knowing serenity, the sunlight catching the delicate hues of the painted limestone. This was no distant goddess, but a woman of warmth and presence. Artists began to depict the royal family in startlingly human moments, Nefertiti embracing her daughters, Akhenaten laughing, their children playing at their feet. For the first time, divinity was shown not as remote perfection, but as something tender, something close. The people of Egypt, long accustomed to the unchanging faces of their gods, now saw their rulers in a new light. Nefertiti's image was everywhere, carved into temple walls, painted on household shrines, woven into the stories told at dusk. She was not just a queen, but a co-ruler, standing beside Akhenaten in scenes of worship and governance, her name spoken with the same reverence as his. In a world where women's roles were often confined to the home, her visibility was revolutionary. She offered a vision of power that was shared, a partnership that blurred the lines between king and queen, mortal and divine. Beyond the borders of Egypt, whispers of her influence spread. Diplomats and traders carried tales of the radiant queen who stood equal to the pharaoh, who shaped policy and faith alongside him. The letters exchanged between Akhenaten and foreign rulers, clay tablets etched with careful script, sometimes bore her name as well, a quiet testament to her role in matters of state. Even in lands where women held little sway, her presence could not be dismissed. The Hittites, the Mitanni, the distant kingdoms of the Aegean all knew of the woman who had helped turn Egypt's gaze toward a single, all-encompassing sun. Yet for all its beauty, this new world was fragile. When Akhenaten died and the old gods were restored, the temples of Aten were abandoned. The city of Akhetaten left to crumble beneath the sands. The art that had once celebrated Nefertiti's likeness was defaced, her name chiseled away in an attempt to erase her from memory. For centuries, she slipped into shadow, a half-remembered queen of a forgotten time. But history has a way of preserving what power tries to destroy. When archaeologists uncovered the ruins of Amarna, when the bust of Nefertiti was lifted from the dust and placed in the light once more, the world remembered the elegance of her features, the quiet strength in her gaze. Here was a woman who had shaped an era. Scholars began to piece together her story, realizing that her influence had extended far beyond the brief years of Akhenaten's reign. Some believe she ruled alone after his death, under the name Neferneferuit, guiding Egypt through the turbulent return to the old ways. Others suggest she vanished, her final resting place still hidden beneath the desert. But whether she faded quietly or ruled fiercely to the end, her legacy endured. Today, Nefertiti stands as one of history's most enduring icons. Her face has graced textbooks and museum halls, her name whispered in classrooms and documentaries. She has become more than a queen. She is a symbol of grace, of power, of the quiet strength that lingers long after empires fall. Modern artists draw inspiration from her. Writers weave her into stories. Activists point to her as proof that women have always shaped the world, even when history tries to forget. In the soft glow of twilight, as the last light touches the edges of ancient statues, it is easy to imagine her still, standing on a sunlit balcony, the golden rays of autumn warming her skin, the rustle of linen in the breeze. She was mortal after all, flesh and bone, beneath the crowns and jewels, subject to the same fleeting joys and sorrows as any of us. And yet, in her brief, luminous moment, she changed everything. The art she inspired, the power she wielded, the love she shared, these things did not vanish with the sands. They linger, quiet but unbroken, like the echo of a voice across millennia. And as you drift now, wrapped in the quiet of night, let her story cradle you. The rise and fall of empires, the shifting of sands, the slow turning of time, all of it fades into the hush of dreams. Nefertiti, too, once closed her eyes to rest, her world alive with the hum of prayers, the scent of incense, the distant murmur of the Nile. And just as she slipped into sleep beneath the same stars that watch over you now, may you find peace in the knowledge that even the grandest stories in the end are made of small, soft moments of love, of light, of quiet breaths in the dark. With the gentleness of falling snow, we transition now to another meaningful chapter in this life story.